started. Welcome to Business Value Creation. It is wonderful to see that everybody values business value. We had to change our room due to the demand. We're very privileged today to have a great guest speaker, which I'll get into. But before, I want to do some housekeeping. We're going to do Q&A in real time. We're not waiting to the end. And we're going to have, for those of you remote, use the QBE Community Yammer group for questions. And we'll answer those here. It looks like we got some more books. So we had first come, first serve. It looks like we're going to have books for everybody. Don't hold me to it, but we made every attempt. So we have two lines. One line is grab a book and go. When you come out this door, there'll be and then Ashu here he'll be glad to sign any book with you. And Ashu's flew all the way out here, and he's willing to stay and talk to you. He'll talk to you about how he'd be willing to meet with you or your group today if you want. So he has some free time, so we're privileged that we can continue this discussion. So what you're going to see today is the beginning of a journey, because business value, the state of business value in industry is borderline disaster. I mean, I've lived with Baker scholars from Harvard and Sloan, and a lot of what I learned in business, accounting principles, are actually practice in the real world. But a lot of the business value concepts are just concepts. They're not practiced. And we see here what we see in most companies, the bookend problem. You have a business case as one bookend, which is fictional to get something funded. Then you have a year and a half go by and people change jobs and there's no accountability for business value realization. So we want to begin with today to begin to work with other groups. There's other people working on business value. We're in QBE. Many of you know us from our community. You go to these events. We're part of SESIT, Strategic Enterprise Services, IT, and working with our groups in SESIT and other groups, we will be doing R&D to address that bookend problem and make business value real. Because we know with our recent events how important generating business value for Microsoft is. So without further ado, I want to describe Ashu Bhatia, some of his highlights. He's currently managing principal at RCG Global Services. That's a business and IT firm. He's held prior management positions at Accenture, Siemens, and American Express. For you belts in the audience, he's a Six Sigma black belt. He's got an MBA from Carnegie Mellon University. And he's got extensive experience in process and systems and value creation. He used to be an avid runner and a skier, but that's been replaced by chauffeuring two children to tennis matches and ballet, if I recall. Yeah. So without further ado, I want to introduce Ashu.
Thank you so much, Mike. Yeah, appreciate it. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you. Thank you. So thanks for the introduction, Mike. And as Mike mentioned, for today's topic, I heard because of the change in logistics, we were trying to get a bigger room and all that stuff. But so I have a certain time frame that I'll work towards. But for sure, I'm happy to stay here. I'm here till the end of the day. And I would love to say, hey, as Mike said, you know what, there's a lot of topics here. This is one of the most talked about and maybe the most misunderstood topic in business and IT. So what we would want to do is get a framework, get an understanding of different topics that kind of merge together. And then I'm happy to stay here, ask maybe more detailed questions as we go on, as well as keep it interactive because, I think the way I look at it is, and I've been to a lot of lunch and learns, you sit here an hour, hour and a half. If you're able to take 3 or 4 things away from this thing, I think that's where it hits the mark, right? Because at the end of the day, if there's some frameworks that sit with you and you can apply them to your job today and tomorrow onwards, that's in my opinion, that's definitely a success for your time. So I appreciate you taking the time today, and let's keep it interactive. Let's see what the topic entails, and we would love to just make sure that we all walk out a little more, aware of what this topic is all about. Technology is awesome when it works. So the way I've laid out the agenda is basically, first is, what exactly is value? A lot of people talk about it. A lot of people understand and say, maybe it's financially driven, maybe it's stakeholders, maybe it's customers, maybe is it these days social responsibility. All those topics have to come together and really define what value is. Because when we understand what it is from a holistic point of view, that's when we can say, okay, we are contributing to this part of value, right? So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then, as Mike mentioned, the book that I've kind of written over the years is kind of broken up into 3 or 4 areas, right? Doing the right things, the what. What is it that we need to be doing? We'll talk a little bit about that. The other thing is, once we have understood what is the right things to do, how do we do those things right? How do we put our processes in place, our tools in place, and our organizational capabilities in place? And we'll talk about which one of those areas are more important than others, depending on the company, depending on the industry, etc. And then once we've done all that, we become healthy, like our individual goals, right? I mean, once we are trying to get healthy, let's stay healthy. Let's put in some controls, etc., to make sure that we are always kind of working towards that arena. And then we'll, of course, recap for the day or whatever. So first of all, what is value, right? Whether you do your own investments, whether you invest in mutual funds or in real estate or in your own career, end of the day, what is it that people expect of that investment? Very high-level things, right? How much money will I have to put in initially? What will I get out of it, right? And we'll talk about all the metrics that people talk about, ROI, payback period, etc. But at a high level, value is all about how much are you going to put in and what are you going to get out of it, basically, at the basic level, right? But another component is, what is the probability of getting what I'll get out of it, right? So there's, there's events that can happen at a macroscopic level, at a very industry-specific level, or at a company level that can affect what you'll gain out of it. So the risk has to be tied up with it, and then we'll take a look at that as well. And then, of course, the biggest question is, when will I get my return, right? If I'm looking at understanding value, when will I get it? Will I get it in a year? Am I competing with X, Y, and Z? Am I looking at a 6-month horizon? Am I looking at a 2-year horizon? So that has to be factored into the concept of value, and you want to understand what that really percolates down to. So with that high-level stuff, I just want to repeat something that we all see, right? So we all are driven by what we call key performance indicators, right? We all have goals that we have in our jobs. We have goals and things that we're measured on, right? And I am a big believer of the fact, and we'll look at operating models, etc. People do what they're measured on, period. It really stops there, because end of the day, whatever you're doing, and if as long as the operating model and what we call the sticks and carrots are aligned properly, people will start doing the right things, and the company begins to walk in the right direction. So whether you say it's market share, it's cost per unit, on-time deliveries, customer satisfaction, whatever have you, there are certain things that people are measured on that they will do and will continue to kind of work towards. So that all feeds into financial indicators. Any company that's public especially, or even if it's private, there's a lot of things that go into what we call return on invested capital. There's growth, there's spread, there's profitability. Again, how much capital are you getting from markets? How much are you investing in? All those, and we'll look at some detailed examples of how those KPIs feed into what the market is really trying to measure. With that comes discounted cash flow, right? So any company that is trying to generate cash flow is saying, okay, over the time, this is how quarter by quarter I'll be generating revenue, and eventually people look at that and say, hey, you know what, from a capital market perspective, they add a few more variables to it and then kind of value the company, especially if it's public. So a company like yourselves, which is big and has so many business units, there's a lot of things that go into understanding and people's perception / real-time perception of that value as well. So there's a lot of things that go into what the company performance is into, and how do you quickly come up with a framework to say, hey, let me break it out and do something that is logical for the projects and initiatives that I'm participating in, and that's always the key. So if I were to look at it, and this is a framework that I try to use quite a bit, because whether your company is public, private, small, medium, large, you've got to understand who the stakeholders and the shareholders are, right? So at the highest level, you've got to be thinking about always increasing operating margin and decreasing your capital. And what that means is You want to be able to generate more from investing less, right? So you want 20% rate of return. You want to invest less capital, less working capital, etc. You want to be able to grow that more and more, right? If you kind of, what this is called is a shareholder value tree, right? You start breaking the nodes. So basically, increased revenue is all about price, about products, about the mix. What is it that you're trying to roll out to the markets? And what is the volumes? Can you do something with all those components to make sure that the revenue is increasing? So a show of hands, how many folks are in IT here, in this, at least here? Okay, so that's, any sales and marketing folks? Okay, I see one hand. And any operations folks? All right, excellent. So there's different value drivers in everyone's mind, because where they participate in the shareholder value tree is going to be a different, paradigm in initiatives and a different paradigm in what they're trying to achieve. And how do you bring it all together, at least have a framework in your mind? That is always key to say, okay, where is my project really working there, right? So on the operating side, you have to be looking at, okay, I've got the investment already done. How do I reduce my cost of goods sold? How do I reduce my SG&A, right? I go into sales and marketing and CRM projects, and they say, well, as long as you're generating revenue, you know what, it doesn't matter how much you're spending on marketing campaigns, things like that. But no, there is a reason why there's constraints, why people are measuring everything, because everything feeds into it's a different variable. On the reducing capital side, any financial folks here from the CFO side of the house? What happens there is, you've got to have all these assets out there in the industry. You've got to be optimizing those as well. I was working with a client recently, and he, made a very good statement. He said they're from the, financial side of the house. We were trying to do some data center consolidation. So it was a CFO initiative to say, hey, we've got all these data centers. I want to be able to do this, but I want to cut costs because of this. So it's not all about cutting costs. It's, as we will see, it's also about building capability. But again, whoever is driving a certain initiative, you need to know what they're coming from. So his, famous thing was, well, every dog has his day as long as it's an alive dog, right? It's not a dead dog. What that means is you can never over leverage yourself and take on so much debt that you can't, pay, your cash flow becomes a problem. So things like that, you have to just understand, where are people coming from? Where is this all kind of driving towards? This sounds more like an accounting focus, but it is important to know, because a lot of those variables feed into some of those numbers finally that get viewed from top down as well. So to break that thing quickly, we've already seen the shareholder value tree, and how does that begin to work towards projects that we all do, right? So if we're talking about revenue growth or cost cutting or just working capital projects, there's many operational levers that come in. So I personally, as Mike introduced myself, I've been in consulting quite some time. I'm recently doing a lot of work for Disney, which is, Disney is all about brand. And I want to take that example because they have a lot of things that go on in different parts of the business units, as is relevant here. But when you talk of, things around, pricing strategy, marketing and promotions, there's different things that come out. Different business units trying different things. How to even look at, the customer from all the angles that you can. Parks and resorts online versus Disney imaging studios versus the restaurants that are selling on the property. How do you combine all that data and be able to know that your customers, I'm able to identify them, give them that experience so that they do not go to my competitor, right? So a lot of operational levers come out of that. From that, and we'll look at the business architecture a little bit, is business capabilities. Are you trying to really help them with just customer self-service, for better experience, or is it really for cost? I'll give you an example. We're working with a financial, consulting firm that does, taxes. A lot of them, just like Intuit, they are basically helping people understand their tax questions, estate law questions, but they've built communities online so that they can then go back and have people address each other's questions. So there's a portal that people can go in, and people who know more can answer some of the questions. So they're involving their own customers to answer some of the questions, because the self-service platform reduces their cost. So there's different things that people are looking at to say, hey, where am I leveraging which business capability really? And from there on, they're then able to say, you know what, now I need to start looking at my KPIs and say, okay, which ones should I be focused on? Because, and we can talk a little bit about metrics. We'll have some of the other content there, but metrics as a company, you need to be knowing why and how these metrics feed into something that is more relevant, from the top down, because the topic of metrics is interesting, right? You can have as many metrics as you want. You can have less metrics as you want. Are they feasible? Where do you get them from? Do they really affect behavior change? That's the key, right? So you just cannot come up and say, okay, you know what, I'm going to start working on this dashboard, and this is what I'm measuring, unless you have a perspective of saying, how does this thing all fit together? Why are you measuring this? What behavior modification are you trying to achieve? And that's when the dialogue begins to happen to say, hey, is this the right thing to do or not, right? Coming to IT, because I saw so many hands, typical, this is empirical data. When IT is really used to maybe optimize its own function, which means, and we'll talk a little bit about that, use ITIL, use COBIT, or any other principle out there to really improve your process. And process is big, as you will see. When you begin to streamline that function internally, you can add half to 1 cent on your earnings per share, typically. This is again from Standish Group, Gartner, and a couple of other empirical data that people publish. But when you take that to the next level and begin to really make some effect on the business model, right? And we'll look at what that means. We'll try to look at what value chains are and where some of those levers can affect the business. When you're able to do that and really optimize that, you're adding much more to that. And in some industries, if you're really able to create more IT-enabled businesses, right, where information is truly used as an asset, you can really affect a lot on the EPS. To give you an example, I'm currently working, and this is something I can share publicly with, so Newell Rubbermaid. This is a company in Atlanta that produces Graco strollers, right? So what they're doing is, whether you call it social media, whether you call it reputation management, they have a department that is focused on what people are talking about. What are they saying in terms of their products being good or bad? They're taking all that feedback, and that feedback is actually going into product development groups and saying, hey, you know what, these are some of the variables we're hearing constantly. So the product development and the product management group is now beginning to use that as an input, apart from internal people, to say, hey, this is what the customers are really asking for. So all the mothers who are reporting, and then they're actually tracking every good feedback, every bad feedback to say, hey, you know what? If there's a problem, they'll try to rectify it. If there's some good ideas, they'll try to take that in. And I see the same thing with hospitality. Companies like Disney or IHG in Atlanta that are, they will also try to remember, if you actually check out into one of the resorts or the hotels and you change the chair or you leave a certain newspaper at a certain angle, they will try to record that so that when you check in next time, they can give you that experience. So they are trying to use a lot of that information for a lot of different things. And as long as you're monetizing those assets, that's when big things begin to happen, right? So state of IT, and that's the reason I asked for which are the different stakeholders. If you look at it, IT comes from different angles, right? So from the top, people are always looking at shareholder value. They're trying to see direction setting. They're trying to understand, is IT really doing what they should be doing? Are they really delivering what will really meet from my business strategy perspective? And this itself is another topic, right? So business strategy, if you talk to 5 different people in the company from different departments, there'll be different answers. So are you really building a wall? Are you building a cathedral? Are you just, building a room? People have different ideas. So you want to bring that all together, but that's what they're thinking about at that level. And if you look at operations for that matter, what they're looking at is complete effectiveness and efficiency. So if I've made some investments, how am I able to get the most out of it, right? So that's what they're looking at. Whereas from a financial perspective, all they're doing is definitely measuring everything on a spreadsheet somewhere, if not financial systems, to make sure that, am I getting the return on invested capital? Am I doing the benefits realization that Mike was talking about to say, hey, that bookend value, I started my initiatives with a certain business case, but am I really achieving that? How do I track that? And then we'll talk a little bit about that. So different perspectives of where IT is being functional. So then it comes down to what is the value of IT, right? I mean, the way I look at it is, and my background is I also kind of grew in from within IT. I think in any company, whether it's federated or centralized or very well-governed or very loosely governed from a corporate structure, IT somehow is kind of the hub of almost every system because they know exactly what's happening in sales. They know exactly what's happening in operations. They know exactly what's happening on the financial side because they have all that information. So how they leverage that and how they're able to affect some of those operating models is key. But for really understanding, there's 3 or 4 concepts on value, right? You need to be able to start thinking in those terms and identify some of those opportunities within the company where there is scope for value. You need to formulate a strategy as well, right? You need to start understanding how will I make use of this information asset, and then compete in the market to get market share, pricing mechanisms, or whatever that you're trying to do from a value lever perspective, and then start saying, okay, you know what, now I need to capture it, deliver it, and then measure it, right? So one of the lack of whether it's, you know, IT schools, business schools, or really out there in the open is there's no such framework to bring all this together, because people are different, companies are different, and what they're competing against is different. So it's all, you know, like when we do software development, right? So we did waterfall, right? And then we did RUP, for those people who remember that, and then we're doing Agile, right? Because there's a certain methodology. There's just some differences for sure, but there's a certain way things have to happen. There's a certain way things are measured. So whether you call it requirements, or you call it backlog, or user stories, or themes, there's a method to how we're delivering stuff. There's no method to say, this is the value we were trying to achieve, this is what we were able to achieve, this is where we couldn't achieve, and oh, by the way, this is where we measured it, right? So as long as you bring that culture within your work, you know, streams, it's defined differently by different people, and hence the results are never measured currently. And I won't even talk about, you know, this value curve, but for each one of those dimensions, you know, just like Gartner does a maturity model, every company has a different way to kind of gauge how we do maturity models. So all those dimensions that we're working towards, you need to understand, where is your company? Where is your business unit? Where is your project on that dimension? Are we misaligned from within the company or from the industry benchmarks? And that's somewhere you have to start with and say, you know what? We're doing all these initiatives, and we'll get to the granular level of projects, but it has to come down from that level and saying, hey, you know what? We are not completely aligned. Even if we're at level 1 or level 2, that's not as important as where is the whole company? Are we kind of aligned amongst that whole capability to kind of be at the right juncture where we can start making some movements, right? With that, once you begin to do that, the main thing that happens is the value management, right? So 3 components, always. As someone said, right? So Mike started with saying, hey, the business case was done. A lot of people use assumptions. And I have seen, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen, when the initiative is being dictated, you can change a few assumptions and everything looks great, you know? I just came back from Charlotte, where Duke Energy merged with Progress Energy, right? So all that merger, the synergies of the IT system, it's a $200 million program. What assumptions were made to say, hey, this is what the benefits will achieve, look great on paper. They look phenomenal, because whether you have timekeeping systems to nuclear is a very different industry in itself, and it's a great exposure to say how much control there is. But once you look at all those assumptions, the business case, everything looks great. But when you begin to do that, it's been an 18-month project, we're on month 12 already, you begin to see that there's some things that are misaligned in those assumptions. So you have to recalibrate that as you go on. How do you measure those benefits realization? If the 2 companies were merging and there's all these assumptions made on, oh, SAP is going to be the source of truth, and this is going to go away. Well, if that doesn't happen because some of the technicians are using a certain system that dictates a certain system, you can't change that, right? How do you measure some of those benefits? And then again, basically, you want a framework to be able to make better decisions, because things will change. When you're executing business and you're running IT, the world is changing, the macroeconomic factors are changing, your company industry is changing, certain competitor will come out with something much more smarter than anyone else, and then you have to recalibrate what you're doing, right? So you have to be a little more nimble than you used to be. And there's examples in the industry, right? Especially in the high-tech industry, and we'll talk a little bit about that, of where your industry falls and what you need to be looking at. But because of all those variables, you just need a little bit of a framework to just make better decisions. And it's not all about costs, it's not all about revenue, but bringing it all together and saying, hey, knowing the path towards the future, right? So a very high-level case of business value realization. So basically, you need to know what targets were there. So when you build a business case, there's so many variables, and we'll look at 1 or 2 examples from data center consolidation, for example. All these benefits that were promised, what were the costs, what is the time frame, and how are you bringing all that together? What were the targets? They all have to be very realistic, and things can change. As we looked at the shareholder value tree, you need to be able to identify the right measures that you're doing so that you're not, misaligned. What is the plan for measuring them, and how do you communicate those results? And then most importantly, how do you take action? What we've seen is when things happen initially, there's a lot of momentum, there's a lot of energy, Some event happens in a corporate world, and everyone's suddenly aligned and looking to go ahead. But slowly, as people don't pay attention to this discipline, what happens is energy begins to fizzle out. People begin to kind of get, absorbed with other, priorities within the company. How do you make sure that there's some kind of coherence for almost all those initiatives that are important, that this is kept on so that the momentum and the energy is always maintained? Because failing which, just like we were at school, during the school, you just cannot study the last, day of when the exam is due. You've got to be making sure you're making progress to where you're trying to get to. So you need to have some kind of framework and be able to define. And what happens is, and we'll look at it most importantly, whether it's IT or whether it's operations, sales, or marketing, what happens is, because a lot of capabilities are being built to really get to where we need to, people are not able to say what benefit was achieved because of which cause, right? So the causal relationships are so important. A lot of people will say, hey, this happened because sales went up because we did the right thing here. This marketing campaign worked, and instead of 2%, hit rate, we were able to get 4%, not because of technology, but because the sales and marketing guys thought of the right campaign. So you got to be able to understand from that node structure, how do you percolate that down and are able to measure it right. So you start measuring that piece, which is very key. Again, just an example. I'll tell you, because this is public information too. So FedEx, had 11 data centers across the world. They were combining that to 3 or 4, 2 years ago. So huge CFO-run initiative from a financial perspective, saying, I am tired of all this spaghetti of servers, software, all the assets that I have. We need to combine all that, rationalize it, make sure that I have some efficiency. Because if you look at any industry, whether it's manufacturing, banking, insurance, information services, 2 to 3% of revenue is typically spent on IT, typically. Banking and insurance will do maybe 4%. Manufacturing might do even 1.5, 1.2. But so FedEx as a company was spending 2.5, 3% of its revenue on IT. And if you look at FedEx, for example, it's not a company that moves products. It's a company that moves products and moves information very quickly, real time, like we all track. It's very important. And they grew by acquisition. Kinko's, Ground, a couple of others. They partnered with USPS. A lot of things happened. So they knew that all their systems were all disparate, and they needed to bring something together to kind of get the efficiencies out of costs, at least. So what was going on is, we said, okay, there were different value drivers, and this is just one of the value drivers. Some cost reduction, cost elimination, efficiency, even risk mitigation, and capability improvement. So the idea was that when you're engaging in that kind of a project, or any project, you need to understand what are the levers that you'll be touching in that project, and are people measuring things rightly? Because if you're effecting some results, they need to be logged in the right bucket, if you will. And I'm sure we have heard of this statement, right? Balanced scorecard. So Kaplan Norton has been saying this for years and years, that you've got to have, whatever you measure has to have a little bit of a holistic view, right? So you've got to have financial perspective, you've got to have, your internal people's perspective, very important customer perspective, and then employee and innovation learning, right? So some of the samples, right? You can use that, and I'm a big believer that, first of all, whatever you measure, it needs to come in from the right value drivers. So whether you call it balanced scorecard or you call it X, Y, and Z, what is important is why you're measuring something and what cause it'll have. What behavior modification are you seeking? Because measuring anything will improve something, but are you running in the right direction, right? So a couple of metrics that IT typically kind of looks at. This is, and I always, this is such a dry topic, because otherwise what happens is IT or operations or sales and marketing, from their perspective, they're always saying, hey, I'm doing the right thing. This is what I was supposed to do. Why am I getting a C+? This does not make sense from my perspective. And someone who's evaluating someone from the other end is saying, this does not make sense. This is something that is wrong, and you get a C+, whereas you thought you deserve an A+, right? Why does that happen? So what really happens in the world, right? So we know, okay, if all these concepts were easy, you get the right recipe, you start going at it, but what happens is, this is the attempt, right? Why? Why does that happen? Time and again, and I've seen that in so many projects, that things do not work out the way they need to be. The intent sometimes is always good, but the attempt is always not as good. Again, some of the reasons, as Mike already started with, SMEs. They don't have, sometimes you don't even know what the future is going to look like, especially in a very quickly changing world, right? In an information technology world, things change very quickly now. There was some news about, Facebook, right? When they were converting their website to different languages. They actually engage their own users, right? And it's public knowledge. They said, hey, we'll start this website. If you know this language, go for it. They build a wiki, and with 70 languages were done by 300,000 users, just like that. In fact, they converted it into a French site in one day and tested it out, right? So things change so quickly. What is the future going to be like? What are people going to use? People don't have that vision. Most importantly that I've seen is, there's more site system and spreadsheet, sure, because there's silo IT always. They say, I need this report, build it in an Access database, give me an Excel, I'll be fine. That all is fine, that indiscipline. But most important is they still follow old processes. People will say, oh, you know what, this is what we're working towards. Okay, these systems have to be put in place, but they're still doing what they think they need to be doing in an old way. Is there an opportunity to kind of not really do business process reengineering? Again, a very misused word, an overused word, but is there an opportunity to look at your value chain, your value stream, and say, hey, why do I really need to do this? Can I cut this step out? Does that make sense? That kind of stuff. So there are a lot of reasons why this attempt is kind of like that. Or you could be a bad cook like I am. But then once you've laid that framework out, you understand what the concepts are, you understand where you're going with this, you have to start thinking about doing the right things, and then we'll get to the how, that is a key, as well as then staying healthy, right? So IT strategy, and again, for me, my background, a lot of industry work, a lot of consulting work, I see time and again, I struggle. I was like, someone asked me, why are you so passionate about this topic? I said, I'm passionate about it because I see this being done wrong, and people, getting wrongly blamed for no reason, right? I see this time and again. And why that is because there's no coherence in what it needs to be. There has got to be 2 or 3 things to be done right. You have to have alignment, you have to have the right process, and then the tools. Like one of my colleagues at work will always say, you know what? A fool with a tool is still a fool, right? So you got to be doing the right thing. You got to be doing the right thing, and then you got to show that yes, you are an efficient house. You are a very efficient house of who is concerned with how businesses are run, right? And running business as running IT as a business in itself. Heavy slide, but what is important is, so when you're doing that IT strategy development, what are some of the most important opportunities, right? You've got to understand what's happening out there, what's happening within your company, and how and what are the most important opportunities. You've got to have some time spent, and you've got to participate, right? Even if it's done from a top-down approach or a bottoms-up approach, someone has to be participating in that and saying, hey, this is what we need to be doing. This is a new platform, right? Everyone is doing WebEx. Everyone is doing, Yammer, for that matter. Where is the future going? Where are some of the things changing, and what should we be doing in terms of opportunities? And once you've decided and spent some decent time, it's kind of like in IT, if you spend some decent time on design, then you have build and testing phases go a little more smoothly, right? And you can have waterfall, agile, whatever. You need to know how you're going to design something properly. So likewise, in business strategy, you need to understand what those opportunities are, understand what the to-be state needs to be in terms of enterprise architecture or operating model, and then start prioritizing some of those projects and initiatives to have implementation plans. So you will see from a process perspective that we'll see in IT, when IT process is laid out, there's a big thing about demand management. A lot of people say, hey, you know what? I need this portal, I need this dashboard, I need this scorecard, and this is what we're going to measure. I'm doling out this product in 6 months. We have to go. Let's go, right? What is important is, sometimes IT bandwidth is limited, right? If there's a pipeline of so much water that you can pump into it, no matter how hard you try, that's the only amount of water that will flow through. So how do you get to a scientific way to say, hey, this is what we have in terms of bandwidth? Yes. If the metrics are, that's why the topic of metrics is important. If you're incented as a company to say, hey, if you are going to be within budget, without too much variance, you're incented, your bonuses are coming, then that's what you'll do. But then you have to have counter metrics saying, hey, your estimates have to be right. They have to be a little more scientific, based on empirical data. They have to be right to say, hey, this is the bandwidth we have. This is all that can happen. And then you can have that dialogue with whoever is involved to say, why are we saying these constraints exist, right? So there's some objectivity that you bring to the table to say, hey, this is how this has to be done. So what I've seen in terms of business and IT strategy is, of course, you've got to have alignment. You've got to make sure that the linkages are there. Everything that you're doing needs to be kind of making sure that the company is moving in a certain direction. And some of the, whether it's in this case example, right, in Microsoft, there's so many products, there's so many business units, right? There's central engineering or decentralized product, whether it's Bing or Live or servers or whatever have you. There's different business units doing different things, huge company. How do you bring it all together to say, hey, almost everyone still should have tight linkages to where we are all marching towards, right? So as long as you have those linkages, then, IT can be, doing the right things to enable it, or even create extra value, if you will. Because if that doesn't happen, this is what typically happens, right? Typically, right? I mean, people are saying, this is not what I asked for. This is not what I wanted to get. So let's be all clear. That's where it all starts from. So business capabilities becomes the biggest thing. Like we saw, like if you unfold the shareholder value tree and look, I mean, you can look at a balance sheet or you can look at income statements or whatever, but the end of the day, it's all summarized in that shareholder value tree. The components there are, what capabilities are you going to build? So business and IT, whether it's operations, sales and marketing, supply chain, IT is an enabler for most of those things. Sometimes it'll also create a lot of extra value and run as a business in itself if you can monetize it, but it's all together, really. You can't separate the two items together and say, oh, this is my turf, that's your turf. It just doesn't work that way. So what you have to be thinking in terms of is business capabilities, right? What is the drivers? What are the imperatives, right? Understand some of the value chain challenges, understand whether it's cost to serve, time to market, margin pressure, whatever have you. What is that burning platform that people are looking towards? And I'll tell you a quick story because that's what typically sticks when you think of business drivers. There was some interview a few years ago, I think on Discovery, which is another client of ours. There was an oil rig fire that happened. There was a gentleman who survived the oil rig fire, so he was interviewed saying, hey, what happened? A lot of devastation happened, whatever. He was on the 12th floor of the rig, and he somehow jumped into the cold water and survived. So they asked him, they said, what happened to you, and what made you think that, yes, if you jump, you will survive, and all this is happening? So he said, the options I had was imminent death or probable death. I had to make a decision quickly because it was a burning platform and I had to make a quick decision. So you need to know for certain parts of your businesses, there's something that you cannot wait. Sometimes I feel, and I walk into consulting firms as well as my own firms, as well as clients, people are running frantically. It's like you're running so fast you forget where you need to go. So you need to spend some time, but in some cases, you need to be very fast time to market. So that's absolutely, because these days, it used to be 10, 15 years ago, you used to have a first mover, but the second person would have all the advantage because they learned most of the things and they would win. But these days, the first mover has that advantage a lot because he's already built the collaboration network. He or she has already built the locking of the customers. And it's going to change because of the way things are going. Once you've locked in the network, you are going to win. So first mover advantage is much more real. They used to say, right, the early bird catches the worm. That's one thing, but it's always the second mouse who gets the cheese, right? Because the first mouse will get trapped. So it used to be a second mover advantage. Now, really, first mover is important. You've got to understand what is it that the industry is moving towards. What is that burning platform that you guys have to look at in certain business units? From there, how does that impact the value chain, right? What business capabilities, again, you've got to be building. And business capabilities, and I could spend a whole day on this one slide, really, but the most important thing is you've got to understand what is it that the company does? What is process, right? It's a list of activities that kind of come in, and there's some input. And for those Six Sigma folks, this whole SIPOC model where there's input, there's output, there's suppliers, customers. But end of the day, what is it that you do? Why do you do it? And how much value have you added in this process, right? So there's a lot of things around value chain analysis for different domains. How is the process working from a decision perspective, from a financial information perspective? How frequently things are added? How much of that can you automate, right? So you look at industry journals about lean, about saying, hey, how do I eliminate some of the redundancy? Should it be pull? Should it be push? How is the flow working? So all that is important, but the idea is that you need to know, most important, why you're doing these things, because all that percolates down to building things. So that's where really, and there's a whole school of thought. People say, oh, it should be systems, it should be tools, it should be change management only, and it shouldn't be process. How do you bring this together, and what is the order or priority? I have seen over the years, at least from a little bit of my perspective, is process is key. You have to understand what is it that you're doing and why you're doing it before you start building and propping up with systems and tools. So then comes system capabilities. I talk to people from an IT perspective, or whether it's CRM, supply chain, or whatever have you. There's a lot of legacy systems, and I'll give you an example. I'm currently doing some work for a U.S. bank. They have a credit card processing company in Atlanta called Elevon. And Elavon, like and Atlanta is a hub of credit card processing companies. There's First Data, Global Systems, a couple of others, TSYS. What they're doing is they have to have the COBOL mainframe systems for transaction processing because of speed, because of things. But on the merchant side, which is their customers, they are beginning to ask for more things. They're saying, hey, if there's certain sale that's happening in a certain seasonality, can I get to know what's selling as product more? If that is something that I can monetize and make sure that my merchants are more incented to have credit card deals on that. So a lot of that data that people have, that is public data, can that be monetized more, right? So they can never get rid of some legacy systems. I get into discussions with legacy modernization. Oh, we don't need to have all this legacy software. We need to kind of get onto new systems. There's a place and a need for everything, right? You've got to have the architecture right, whether it's technical architecture or business architecture. There's a rationale why some of those things will work in certain ways and some things won't. So systems will come again to say, hey, what are they supporting, whether it's on the application layer, technology, information, and I think, of course, the SDLC, and then you have to have process on your PMO as well. It can be centralized, it can be decentralized, but you've got to have some way of thinking coherently there. And once you've done all that, some of the things that I constantly see missing is people do focus a lot on systems, a lot on processes these days. What they don't focus is on this big thing, installation versus adoption. Like this nuclear, Duke Energy merging with Progress Energy, some of the people who are actually using some of the systems in those, sites, as they call them, they will not adopt certain things just because it's installed. Not only training, not only why, because of certain real parameters that they are constrained with, they will not use it, right? So unless you think about change management and change enablement, all that will not come together because you can put all the processes in the world, all the systems in the world, end of the day, it's still people. People are going to use and do what they do, right? So you've got to bring them together and have that component working very, very closely to say, hey, how do you mitigate some of the risks? How do you manage that knowledge? How do you acquire the talent? How do you train the talent? How do you retain it? How do you make sure it doesn't walk away? There's no flight risk. How do you make all that together? So say all these capabilities have to be working in the company, and only then will it all come together. Otherwise, things begin to fall through the cracks. And I always put a little humor in every slide. Process is important. Systems are important. And of course, company and organizational is important. So that's all very important to bring it all together when you're thinking of capabilities, saying, hey, you know what? In fact, in this $200 million program that I'm talking about, two companies merging, all from the IT perspective only, they're saying there's a change management group that had no funding. They were like, yeah, well, we got to do the systems first. We got all this methodology, these deadlines. Let's go, go, go. Yes, we'll train them and we'll have some budget for you. It was an afterthought, right? And of course, you cannot overspend on anything, but you've got to at least have the discipline to say, what about the user manuals? What about the standard operating procedures? How many things will change? You don't have to change everything. So everything was thought through later because, again, it comes from the top sometimes. There's a rush to get things done. Those assumptions in the business case, those levers that people want to tune, they want to get going because, again, people do what they're measured on, whether from top or the bottom. People whose bonuses and livelihoods are attached with something, that's what they'll do. So you have to be at least cognizant of those facts. So when you do that, we saw the top-down of capabilities, and this is an IT crowd, so I won't even spend too much on this, but this is important too, at least for those people who are not from pure IT. Technology infrastructure, which a lot of people call plumbing, frankly, right? Infrastructure, whether you take it on the cloud or you have your own things that you bought. I talk to a lot of business side folks, especially from operations or financial side of the house. They're like, okay, that's all plumbing, that's great. I don't care. This is what I need to get done. So whatever, if you take it on Azure, that's great. Or if you want me to buy these servers, that's fine. What will I get? That's their thinking. That's what they're always thinking. Because a lot of that enables the application layer, and then most importantly, the information layer, and then the business architecture layer, right? So you've got to have some, people, whether you use any tool that you use, but end of the day, you've got to have some business architecture say, how is all this coming together? Whether you do it through swim lanes, through Visio diagrams, or whatever have you. The tools are somewhat important, but what is important is how does it all feed into eventually to build those capabilities. Are you only doing back office optimization? Are you really completely doing CRM? Or like in the industry that I participate quite a bit these days is hospitality, pricing algorithms, right? I'll give you an example. And it's also public information. So Marriott Vacation Club, which is a subsidiary of Marriott International Hotels in Orlando, they are always dealing with making sure that hotels, like airlines, if you have a flight that takes off, if you have a room that goes unused for a night, that's lost revenue, right? So they want to be able to optimize marginal revenue and say, you know what, whether it's on Expedia or anywhere else, how do I know what people are tracking, what they'll buy, so that I can make sure that I reduce my rates if I need to, or bump up my rates if it's in high demand? How do I gauge all that? And what that industry calls it is called yield management or revenue management, right? What they're doing is they are beginning to tie some of the data that they have empirically to external data now, right? So the Weather Channel, which is in Atlanta, has a lot of history on how the weather changes all over. They have historical data of how much demand they had. They're trying to tie it up with weather, events, and a couple of other things to say, hey, can I now bring all this together and say, you know what? I think I understand my pricing algorithms a little better, and I can raise my room rates for this October season by maybe another $10, because that'll percolate down to that much revenue. Or when it comes to September or right after Thanksgiving for a few weeks when there's almost no demand, let me reduce that, right? Because I have to compete with, 1,000 other competitors in that space to bring it all together. So pricing in that sense is key. And from another perspective, because the Weather Channel is also a client of ours, the Weather Channel is now saying they were a little bit in trouble with all the media issues that they were having, but they're beginning to say, we have all this data. They're beginning to write APIs on their weather where people can tie it into that and they can sell some of that data, which is, public information, but they want to sell it by saying that. So how do you optimize and monetize some of that data that you have and think of revenue and think of how this thing will come together? Because when you know that, oh, you know what? They used to say that every S&P 100 company used to have a lifespan of at least 50 years. That time span is really going less because of the way things are changing, right? I mean, with new companies coming in, it's typically 20, 17 years these days, at the most. So you've got to be thinking, you need to know of that burning platform in your head to say, how do I monetize some of those things and bring it all together? So when you're building those capabilities, eventually, what is it that you're going for? Is it going for only revenue, or cost cutting, or some strategic compliance capabilities that are key for you to be able to think through, right? As an example, this is for retail or even hospitality. So once you break the value chain, right, there's parks and resorts. So Disney recently opened Shanghai in China, and they've done Paris for a few years ago. Concept and supply planning key. How do you buy the things? How do you build a package? And how do you kind of get the demand fulfillment piece going? Sales distribution, and just like any other retail store, which channel, and then how do you segment your customers, and then how do you service operations, and then, of course, how do you have supporting functions to make sure that all that works? You got to think through all this because you're saying, okay, if at all I'm thinking here, self-service, then there's different capabilities to build. The things that you will, build will depend on if you're working on a certain project or an initiative, how does this thing come together? Which part of the value chain am I affecting? Am I doing some kind of a call center product to improve my average call time? Or am I really kind of working towards some supply chain work because I need to kind of optimize that piece? Or am I working towards completely the content management piece of the package build? You need to know at least where is this all fitting in the whole grand scheme of things, and eventually in your customers too, right? So you've got to think through that. You've got to think through the process and then drive towards IT. And that typically is the message to say, hey, you've got to think through the holistic picture before you start doing things. The most important thing I think is, and again, there's so much going on in the world today, and all of us bring immense value, I think, to the table. We have all different experiences, whether it's in this company or other companies that we work for, that we can put to task, but you need to have some sanity to put some structure around it, right? So all these concepts, how do you say, what is important really? Is it intellectual property? Is it physical asset that's important? And how much is your industry changing? How does that apply, right? So I would think for the company, that we are all here at today, you need to know that certain spaces are much more faster moving than others. If there's a disruptive change, and because of which, and there's again this whole, and you guys, absolutely go back and search on being first, competitive advantage of first mover versus second mover. You can look at the history and say, okay, more and more, the way the world is going, first mover truly becomes an advantage. It never used to be, right? That is key. If you work in manufacturing, if some of your clients are just buying servers, etc., why are they doing that? Or what are they trying to do from their perspective? Are they just slow moving? Is there pressure only on cost cutting, operational excellence? As you all know, right? There's 3 value disciplines. You can be operationally very efficient. You do everything that others do at a very mere cost like Walmart and get there. Or are you looking at customer intimacy? Is it all about branding and experience like Disney? Or is it all about, the focus around just product leadership, right? Like a Rolex. Anyone will pay anything for that brand. So where somewhere in that dimension are you guys playing, and how are things changing? And I think for sure any company these days has a lot of physical assets. Typically, even Amazon has started to kind of open those, physical stores. And there's a lot of intellectual property as well. So even in manufacturing, even in a company like FedEx, which is more supply chain, there's a lot of intellectual property. So there's all those assets in the company. How do you leverage that, and why do you need to leverage that for which initiative becomes key as to where you want to be. And that thinking has to happen, right? You have to understand where is your competition going, who are you competing against, and what is going to drive some of the changes. So once you've understood the what, right, the key becomes, and again, let me stop here. Any questions as yet? Anything that triggers some thoughts? Yes, no, what about this? We can do it in the end, or we can do it as we go on. Okay. Yes. Right.
So just been deliberating on this. When you were talking about transformation,
right,
and an organization, and you had that particular, the slide that had several boxes and which said these are the reasons why transformation kind of fails. I was also thinking about, let's say an organization decides to institute a new process, right? Both at an IC level, at an individual contributor, up to the management level. There is different levels of kind of atrophy, if you will, in terms of data,
yep,
in terms of awareness of what processes drive the business. And very often we tend to hold tight to some of those processes because we don't see another alternative, right? It's hard to tell. So what kind of tested strategies can you offer which allow organizations to set themselves up for success, particularly when this kind of metamorphosis is happening within the organization, so that everyone's resonating versus this dissonance, right, between like one, the management says this, but that translates into something else, and the management is oblivious to something that's the everyday process, which is literally being yanked off.
Right.
So any thoughts on that would be great.
Yeah. So just so that everyone gets the question, I think the question is, if there's changes in the process and it's happening at almost sometimes from a top-down approach versus a bottoms-up approach, how do you make sure that that process is understood, agreed upon, and hence implemented? Is that the question? So the way that works is, and some of the things that, and every company is different, to be honest with you. That's what someone said, culture eats strategy for lunch. You can have all the strategy in the world, but as long as you don't begin to paradigmally shift some of the culture and the thinking, it won't happen. So the way that problem statement work is, when you have a certain process that you're trying to imbibe, right? Whether it's in your individual contributor, for your software development, for your operations, supply chain, whatever, you need to understand why that process is being applied, first of all. So if top-down managed, and I'll tell you one, and I'll be honest with you, because I want this thing to be very interactive, and it gets, for lack of better words, controversial. A lot of stakeholders in that value chain and that stakeholder value tree that you saw are sometimes their goals are at loggerheads with each other. And what that means is the operations folks will say, I want more inventory, because that way I'll never have a stock out. I don't care about cost, right? Sales and marketing is like, yes, I want more and more spread out in all my distribution centers. I don't care. Let's just do it. Whereas the financial guys will be like, no, this doesn't make sense. I got to optimize that. So you have to understand how many metrics are being laid out and how those metrics are devising some of those processes and what the intent of those processes is. As long as the intent of those processes from top down has been agreed to, and people are saying, hey, you know what, we have to start changing some of the ways. And I'll give you an example, at least that I've seen time and again, and it must happen here as well in some business units, is I have clients who say, oh, waterfall, because that's what they're all comfortable with. Then they'll say, oh, it has to be agile. Even if it's a business intelligence data-driven project, we'll build proof of concept and we'll go on. All those methodologies have a space and a reason for why they work, and you can have the process right or wrong as you apply it to a certain domain. But if people need to be convinced before they follow this process, that is the idea. So if it's happening from top down, you have to have people from bottoms up participate in that. They have to have some, even if, because everyone, I'll be honest with you, everyone wants, all of us, and it gets into philosophy very quickly, at a human level, want appreciation. It's Maslow's need hierarchy, right? You've got to have basic needs, you have to have a job, and all that stuff works into your thinking. But end of the day, you need to be convinced why this process is important. So if the top-down approach is not working, one of the things that works is involving some of your, change enablers in that middle layer, right? Saying, hey, you know what, guys, we need to be thinking because if we continue on this path, we're not achieving the results that we were set out to achieve. So you need to have a middle layer that involves both those layers, if you will, the people who are really doing work and people who are deciding on process, and have that debate and say, let's understand the rationale of having the process, where will it affect some results, and why are we trying to affect some of those changes? So the change impact and the change benefits have to be elaborated, and everyone has to get on the same page before it really begins to happen. I don't know if I answered some of the, and it's a very tricky question, very good question. Yep.
Yeah. When you think about what you just talked about a little bit, and then we're looking at big data and data analytics, it seems, there's two kinds of companies that seem to be splitting apart out there. Those that really believe in the data analytic concepts and are really embracing it wholeheartedly quickly, and those that don't, and they're sort of more wait and see. And I was wondering, it's kind of a complex question to ask. So we have a lot of change coming in some organizations that makes implode on themselves just because they're changing too rapidly or too much, and then others who are almost stagnating, if you will, and may wither off and die. And I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
It's a very relevant question in this time and age, right? So big data. So the question was, initiatives like big data and analytics and maybe the predictive analytics, where do they stand? And is this mostly hype? Is it going to be real value? Are we doing the right things? Are the customers thinking the right things, right? So, and I would say big data is a very evolutionary area right now, because to get big data right, you need to have your traditional enterprise data warehousing at least somewhat right? And what I mean by that is, so for those people who understand data and information management, you've got to have your sources of data. It's like an information supply chain, right? So data is coming in whether from outside or from inside. You extract it right, you store it right, whether it's in EDW, whatever operational data sources, or your data marts and silos that you might have, and then how are consumers consuming those reports? So the whole spectrum of information lifecycle management, and now to add to that mix is an external feed of data, whether it's Twitter, social media, whatever, because big data is defined differently by different people. Is it only volumes? Not really, because sometimes it's also about velocity, variety, and all those 3 V's. But end of the day, and I'll give you some examples in that space, what is right is, how can you leverage that quickly to affect some value? And what I've personally seen as yet is, big data has 2 use cases really as yet. One is the lower cost of technology itself. So from a pure technology perspective, you had all these licenses you're paying to Teradata, Netezza, et cetera. And if some of you guys came from there, we can meet in the parking lot. So you're paying all these licenses. A lot of our clients are saying, hey, you know what, can I take all that to a Hadoop and an open platform and say, hey, you know what? And yesterday itself, I was talking to a company in Atlanta. It's a web analytics company that sells cars online, and I can't say their name. But they're saying, let me take all this onto a Hadoop platform, let me flatten all the data out, and let people play around with it, let them self-serve sandbox, and then do some reports, purely from a cost perspective. But if you talk to the business side of things, they'll say, you know what, I don't care if you tell me it's big data, Hadoop, or whatever have you, or Plum, Green Plum, or whatever have you, as long as you're able to tell me that if I run this marketing campaign or someone is talking bad about this place, how can it affect some more cost cutting or sales, right? End of the day, a lot of people think about if revenue is key, right? So they're saying, hey, how can I increase my cross-sell or upsell? I have companies who are coming from a very, very traditional background like insurance, who are very conservative. But they are investing in big data as well to say, hey, can I, if someone is buying a lot of property and casualty, what can I sell here and there? So the idea is that big data as a new capability, if you're thinking through, has to have a picture in your capability, diagram, right, if you will. What that means is, have I cleaned house my information internally? Am I able to even understand the data that my internal people are generating? And then maybe I can tie up some external data. I'm thinking of some examples to give you of, I talked about social media and how Graco, Newell Rubbermaid, is using some of that data for their product management. I also was talking to Marriott Vacation Club where they're trying up weather data, which is a lot of data, right? So they have to invest in some platform that does things very quickly. But I was talking to a lady in a networking event the other day, an old 60-year-old, 70-year-old lady who kind of had a great network in Atlanta. I just met her. She had a small little business of her own. She gave me a business card. I said, what do you do? And she goes, you know what? I actually have a lot of friends and, in this demographic, in this Atlanta market, and I'm able to understand what they are typically buying from all these retail stores, whether it's Nordstrom or the high-end retail store, Chico's, etc. And I'm able to know what sizes they like, which patterns they like, and we're able to kind of have some effect on Groupon, and I kind of get those Groupon deals, and then I'm able to distribute them to my friends, and we buy it as, So that's the business model. She takes a cut of something in the middle just because of the business model. She knows what people are buying, she knows where it's coming from, and she's able to get in middle of, and then just generate a small business around that. The reason I give you that example is, if you take that spectrum onto big data for what companies are doing, is it's all about knowing something a little before your competitors, or knowing something that the customers don't know as yet that they need, right? And bringing it all together. So whether you define it as big data because of the changes in data or because of the volumes in data, it has to sit in your capability model and saying, hey, you know what? Yes, I think this, and there's all these tools out there, NLP, all that stuff that can, and I know a lot of companies are investing in, forget text search, do voice search. If I have a video working, why can't I do a voice search of something that's relevant to me? So all that data, if it's being used for the right thing in terms of either sales generation and increase in revenue growth or cross-selling or upselling, or reduction in my supply chain costs, then it's very relevant. Otherwise, if the more you say it, the more you talk about it, the more it sounds like it's only a fad, it's it's soup of the day kind of thing, and it'll go away. Does that answer your question at a high level?
Yeah, I think so. That's part of what I was wondering about is the change itself in the organizational structures.
Yes, yes. Yes. So
organizational structure as compared to those who aren't changing.
Yes, yes.
How do you think about those dynamics?
So the question is, if you're investing in that kind of capability, what kind of operating models do you changes do you do on an organizational side, on the process side, and or the system side? I always boil it down to those three things in the framework. How do you make some of those changes to affect the right thing within that space? And the area there is, you've got to have the right business intelligence side of the house, the right data management piece of the house. So business intelligence is more on the reporting side and what people are going to do with what comes out of it. And the data management side is who owns the data, where's the lineage, who is the data steward, data governance, IT governance, and corporate governance on top of that. But at the end of the day, some of those model changes will begin to happen. That's the only way that capability will work. And I'm happy to give you some more insights on how that percolates down. So in the interest of time, I know I've got people looking at me. I know I've got 15 minutes, and this is not that bad. So once you understood what has to be done, how do you do that right? You've got to have your own IT house efficient, like the first half to 1 cent of EPS. There's different things. There's spend and value, there's governance and decision making, there's architecture management. How do you get new applications or big data solutions out there? And then once you have them, how do you service them? Whether you use ITIL, whatever you use, and then eventually, more importantly, how do you manage the workforce and the resources around it? So you got to have different capabilities within your IT space. Like someone was talking to me the other day, new application build-up, you got to have program management, project management, some SDLC, but then once that is out there, how do you introduce changes? How do you make sure the operational infrastructure is changing behind that? A lot of discipline there. You got to make sure that that is all right. But one of the biggest things that I see lacking is the spend and value measurement, right? So how much money are we spending? How much is that allocated to which business unit? You can call it activity-based costing, you can call it whatever, but basically, people don't even know. In so many big, mature companies that are on the Fortune 10 list, when you go down to that level, they don't know how much money they're spending on which things, right? So that becomes a very, very important discipline to say, hey, how do you do that? Because if that is not done, what happens is, when you walk in, and I don't know, every company has a different fiscal calendar, but when you walk in during those strategy planning sessions and you're beginning to get into middle management where you participate in some of those sessions to say, hey, you know what, I need X number of $1 million for this, and that, right? And then your manager goes up and fights it out and says, oh, you know what, I could only get 70% of that, or whatever. That is all based on historical spend and what the competition is doing. So that statistic I gave you, 2 to 4% of revenue is what typically is spent on IT. This varies differently. And once that is done in a wrong manner, there's no recognition for some of the contribution to the business side. Because people don't understand it, they start cutting. When times are tough, they start cutting costs even more. As a result, IT capabilities shrink even more. And then what happens is, because of that, overall budget gets squeezed and squeezed, and people are not able to deliver the capabilities that are important. So it's almost like a vicious circle that goes on and on because of that lack of communication or the lack of insight. And how do you stop that? I'll let you read this for a second. That's what happens, right? What is the budget? What can you do with half of that? Fail. All right, you start, right? And that's, at a bottom line level, that's what happens in so many initiatives, saying, oh, you know what? Yeah, testing. Well, I think we can squeeze that to 2 weeks. That will be fine, right? So I have seen that SVP level and all that stuff. And how do you prevent that? Because end of the day, no one has a discipline on cost. And I won't get into numbers quickly, but when you build a shareholder value tree, and we've done this a lot, you start doing some kind of sensitivity analysis, right? So for lack of a better word, it's just a mathematical model. When you have different nodes within your shareholder value tree, you can quickly see if you change 1% of some of the spend, where is some of that change happening on your different nodes? And then you can say, and we'll talk a little bit about discretionary versus non-discretionary, you can try to see what is misaligned. You can try to get a little scientific about that whole subjective area of why the spend is too large or it's too low, because that is just a subjective statement, right? Oh, large or low, right? So how do you kind of start using that to make some more numbers? Because what happens is, this is what happens, right? When you start to look, and I've walked into this data center consolidation project, we walked into data centers and said, okay, how much are you spending on Windows Server? How much are you spending on XYZ server? And then how much are you spending on these applications? People had some idea, talked to procurement, their enterprise licensing agreements will have some numbers that you can start collating. For a company like FedEx, and I can say that, for a company like FedEx, I was starting my career, and I thought, oh, you know what? I understand numbers. I get it, and I'll build the right model. You spend weeks to even get the numbers, if you can get it. And then which business unit owns which asset? You spend another couple of weeks, and then the SVP and CFO are saying, I need a business case. Come on, let's go, right? So you have to have crawlers to even understand your asset inventory. You don't even know that. And then how much you spend on it, that's the kind of paperwork it takes. So when I actually saw this carton, which I read a lot, I was like, this is exactly what happened to me in that project. So at a high level, overall IT spending, right? We all spend money on email servers and things like keep the light on and all that stuff, but there's got to be some money spent on things like big data, things like mobility solutions, right? Things like, so if you read all the articles out there in the industry, cloud, mobility, and big data are kind of like those variables people are playing with, saying, hey, this is what the future is all about, and some of that leverage different clients are trying. But how do you decide how much money is spent on this versus that, right? Again, as part of metrics, you can have empirical data if the company's been watching and measuring things. Typical split is 40-60 for a good case, but in most of the companies that I've seen, it's 10 and 90%, 20 and 80% ballpark, right? So you can base that off, industry benchmarks, if you will, and then try to see what your competitors are doing, because different spending on different things will get you different results, right? So infrastructure management, you cannot do without it. You need to spend some money on it. Required maintenance, technical support. But then what is more enabling and strategic, and how much can you start spending on R&D dictates different things. So how much is your split between discretionary and non-discretionary is very key to understand how the company is spending money and where it's trying to go. So once you've done all that, so the idea of IT spend was to say, hey, this is the money we have, this is what we're doing. It gives you a justification to say, hey, if you are trying for me to kind of come up with some big data capabilities, I need so-and-so kind of people on the OpEx side, professional services, or my own talent, and I need so much hardware. You've got to build a TCO, right? You've got to understand what hardware, what software you're going to buy, and kind of build that before you even start building those capabilities. So once you've done all that, once you're beginning to get a little healthy, the key is to stay healthy, right? So we all try, we all struggle. There's all those ideals we all have to say, hey, you know what, if I'm running so much, I got to keep doing this much or eat that much. end of the day, likewise, in IT or in your business, you need to have some kind of controls to make sure that what I call the bad carbohydrate, or just processed carbohydrate, for example. Having things that are kind of redundant. Why have that? Why have systems carbohydrate, right? Why so many assets and servers when I can do it with this piece? That's where big data really came from. If you look at the history of all the technology, instead of buying this huge expensive server and putting it all in stack and having processing power, I can just distribute it on different clusters and have, do it much more cheaply. And that's the bottom line that Hadoop came in from, right? So how do I take my CapEx into more an OpEx platform, whether you call it cloud or utility computing or whatever have you, how do I take that and what kind of capabilities do I build to avoid waste? Because that big server that I've spent millions on, maybe 40% of the time it's just sitting idle, right? So how do I do that and what do I think of? So in terms of projects and IT projects, you've got to have some kind of portfolio management, right? What that means is you've got to understand how much your spend is allocated to different things, which capabilities do they point to, and how much dollars are being allocated to each piece, and how much risk is being addressed to say, hey, you know what? This is how my mix was. This is where I need to get to. And you won't get that within 2 months, 3 months, but at least you'll have a picture, a roadmap to say, hey, I'm here in the current state. I'll be here in the future state, whether it's over phases that in the duration long, 16 months, 18 months, 24 months, at least I'm getting there. And for me to be able to measure that, right? And saying that I'm getting there. So portfolio, project portfolio management, I think, is definitely just a part of your asset portfolio, just like you have, retirement funds, right? You put some in mutual funds, some in international growing stocks, some more in this stock or this category. You have asset portfolio, which is applications, again, data, all infrastructure, and then eventually, how are those projects mapping to each back and forth? So part of your alignment is to say, okay, this is all I have. This is what I'm doing. If I'm going to be rationalizing some of my assets, and I'm going to be rationing some of my hardware assets, information assets, or application assets, these are the projects that will be impacted, and this is how I have to manage them. So you have to have Mike. Okay, yep. Absolutely. 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 So the time warning has been at me. So and I think, and this is something that I think we all understand, at least the framework. We understand the concept. So I'm happy to address some of the questions. The idea is to say, what? Sounds good. So I will be outside, happy to sign some of the books that are out there, and then I can be back here. As I said, I'll be here all day. If there's any questions, and I know everyone has projects and things to do, so I'm happy to be in this room or anywhere else that we want to do and address some of the specific questions. But the idea is have some kind of a development roadmap, have things that are kind of going towards where they need to, and then the main thing that I wanted to kind of, as I said, 3 or 4 points that you want to take away is first, be customer-centric. Understand who your internal customers are or external customers are. Why are you doing certain things? Always focus on the value tree if you can, and then understand that good problem definition is key. Is it a process problem, a systems problem, or an organizational problem? You need to have a grip on that. Always have that investment-driven mindset, because whether you manage your own investments or your work, you've got to have, you need to know why you're doing it, how you're going to track it, and then eventually focus on always results and have a little bit of a measurement mentality. So these 3 or 4 points was the main takeaway of all this framework. And as I said, there's a lot of frameworks. There's a lot of things that go into those frameworks. Happy to address most of those questions again. And I know someone asked for, contact information. If you go to ashubhatia.com, there's a blog, and there's all these things that I write about as much as I can, big data, analytics, whatever these days. But feel free to go there or reach out to me, and I'm happy to answer any questions, because these are things we all struggle with. So I'll open the forum for questions, because I think that's the only time we have, 6 minutes.
So, Ashu, we have a few questions that are coming in over Yammer.
Okay.
So the first question here from Aaron. What strategies can you recommend for helping drive adoption and consumption versus just installation?
Right. So, and I think that kind of percolates down to the other question. So adoption versus installation is so key. installation is driven by the mindset that if I put something and it's a measured numbers game that I can get things done, the adoption principle will always come from saying, hey, always remember that it's people who actually make things happen. So they have to be change enablers. They have to know why the change happened, and they have to be trained and brought into the mix before that can happen. So adoption is much more complex because the number crunching is somewhat easier. It's the hearts and mind campaigns that is always tougher, and people are always involved in that. You have to pay attention to that.
I was hoping you could speak to the potential costs with changing processes or technologies. It seems like learning curves with new processes and technologies is very expensive. So do you have any general rule of thumb or advice when it comes to deciding whether to make the investment to make changes or to stick with older processes that are more efficient in the short term?
Very good question. So the question is, when you're talking of change in process or systems and even organizational, how do you decide what makes sense? So the way we've addressed some of those questions for a lot of clients is saying, hey, you've got to almost have, if there's initiatives, whether it's system changes, process changes, you've got to say ballpark, that's what has to happen from a business case perspective. You've got to know how much cost there will be to do that, and then you've got to quantify some of those value variables that will be affected. So you can't have a complete business case per se, but you need to have ballpark categories of how much my benefits are and how much my costs are, and then what is the feasibility, and then lay out different initiatives to say, hey, in this sense, it only makes sense to change the system. For example, if you're doing supply chain management and you're only looking at SKUs that are kind of in your retail centers, then you need to be able to say, hey, you know what? Without much change in process, I can still make this happen because end of the day, people are interested in that data. But when you're talking about the way people work in maybe stocking warehouses, et cetera, that will induce more changes on the process. So 10 to 20% is the range that is typically given to both those kind of areas to say, hey, you know what? Based on how I lay out my matrix, this is how much I will give to some of those changes. Any other question on Yammer? Or that?
Another question. Just to follow on from value creation versus value realization, which typically has a long time horizon. Value realization has typically has a long time horizon, rather than an impact in the same year. So, with our business climate of a short-term view, can you shed some light on what might be a better way to verify the value realization?
Right, and so the question is, for when you do that value realization, the whole big chevron that we said, okay, you got to have metrics, you got to measure it because they have a feedback loop. These days, the timelines are squeezed more and more. So the question is, if I understand it right, is how do we improve that part to make sure that some of the initiatives that we're doing that have very short time to market are actually achieving that benefit? So the key there is that as long as you have established that initiative as part of some decision-making framework where the business case is proving itself, even if the numbers change a little bit, that doesn't change the decision. If the ranges change a little bit, that doesn't change the decision. So for some things that are on the burning platform, you can cut some edges on doing that benefits realization measurement because you cannot measure everything. That is, you got to be practical, right? So for certain things, whether it's like mobile or health on IT and all that stuff, if things are already catching on and the time horizons are less, you can put something at a very high level as long as the business case has already proven itself. You don't need to have all the as they say, the Bible of benefits realization, executed, because you will never get there, because people think of that as cost as well. So you cannot entail that if the time horizons are too long, but if it's on a burning platform and the decision is made on a business case, then at least as a company, you're set in the right direction. All right, I think that's the time. Any other questions last minute? But I'll step out in case I can sign a few books before people get back to their work, I guess. Any other question?
I actually do have one last question,
Yeah.
hopefully quick. So a lot of what you presented today rings completely true to me. In IT, in Microsoft, there's a very strong culture of engineering being king. So my question to you is, how do you help people with a strong engineering background and no business background really understand the value of these concepts?
Right. And I think the question is, if you're coming from an engineering background, and if I understand it right, like at Disney, what they call engineering background is knowing software, knowing real engineering, and then infecting in systems. Because some of the things that Disney will never share with anyone, and I can't share, it's called next generation experience. It's all about making the customer experience better. You've got to have engineering layer that ties up, it's like the middleware layer, right, of making sure that things are going on. So if you have a business background and you understand engineering, what I would say is have a little bit of focus on the accounting piece of your projects, because that always helps. Because end of the day, when you measure value, the first that'll come is the numbers, right? And then it'll come, okay, when you look at the balanced scorecard, the first thing that people will see is financial metrics. They will look at ROI, they'll look at all those. That's the most important one. And then they'll look at customer satisfaction, employee satisfaction, innovation, learning. But if you are going to prioritize that, and if you have that background, it's always good for anyone to say, hey, you know what, from an accounting perspective a little bit, how am I participating in reduction in cost of goods sold, SG&A, or if I'm participating in CRM projects, whether it's through big data or anything else in mobility, what kind of revenue effect are people trying to capture? That is one of the things you should always pay attention to. Well, I will say thank you again. Thank you for your time. I know this was a lot of work. Thanks again for having me.